I would like to begin by welcoming everyone to the UBC Public Humanities Hub Public Scholarship Panel, co-hosted with the University of Victoria's Visual Storytelling and Graphic Art in Genocide and Human Rights Education. I'm Andrea Webb, the co-director of the project and faculty member in the Faculty of Education at UBC, with my colleague, Matt Hukulak, we will be moderating today's panel or discussion, sorry. We want to begin by acknowledging that UBC is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people, land on which we are uninvited guests. We are grateful to be able to do this work here, and because today's discussion is virtual, we invite attendees to acknowledge to the territories in which they are joining us today. Today's event, featuring Tim Cole from the University of Bristol, is the first in a series of 5 about the ethics of trauma-informed research that the Hub and UVic are sponsoring this year. So before we get started, I'd like to tell you about the other 4. Next Thursday, May the 4th, Erin Jesse from the University of Glasgow will be joining Matt and I to talk about ethics in testimony gathering. On May 23rd, we have Shannon Leddy talking about ethical relationality and Indigenous story work. On July 6th, George Beliveau and Christina Cook will be sharing their work on trauma-informed research with survivors. And later in 2023, Shell Anderson will join us for a talk about human rights approaches to witnessing and testimony gathering. And finally, the Canadian Journalism Forum on Violence and Trauma presentation is to be determined. We hope you can join us for one or all of these events.
Thank you, Andy. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming from the University of Victoria, which is situated on the lands of the Lekwungen speaking peoples whose traditional territory the university stands, as well as the Songhees Esquimalt Wasanic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. The library itself is situated on an area that was once camas fields, where the local peoples would gather for farming, nourishment, and coming together to share information. And it is in this spirit that I hope this series also nourishes everyone involved. I'd like to introduce Tim Cole now. Tim is professor of social history at the University of Bristol, where he specializes in Holocaust studies, environmental histories, and digital humanities. He was the founding director of the Brigstow Institute that seeks to develop equitable research relationships between academics from different disciplines and community and creative partners. Tim is also an academic advisor to the Dan David Prize, and since 2020 has been chair of the History Commission set up by the Mayor of Bristol in the wake of the toppling of the Colston statue.
So today's event is intended as an introduction to participatory action research or engaging in community-focused research. So in our conversation, Tim, who comes from history and Holocaust studies, myself coming from education, and Matt from library, are going to talk about how we come together as academics and creatives and communities to discuss why we might want to work this way and what are some of the challenges and opportunities that are part of that. So Matt's going to begin with our first conversation and topic.
Thank you for joining us today, Tim. And I suppose my first question is the big one. What is participatory action in your definition? And how do you define trauma-informed research?
Yeah, so those are terms that, in a sense, I would rarely use as a historian. I guess one thing that's interesting is to think a bit about the way that terminology is often very disciplinary specific. So it often emerges in very particular times and particular places. And I guess participatory action research is a term that emerges kind of in the 1940s. It's, I think, the first time really that you start to see people using this term. And it's particularly a term that emerges within social policy, in education. But it's a term that I think I'm really happy to embrace much of what it stands for. And maybe we could say the same around trauma-informed research. So whilst I reject the kind of terminology, because it doesn't really sit easily with the kind of disciplinary positioning that I'd have as a historian and as a humanist rather than a social scientist, you know, I guess I sit at the cusp really of human geography and history in my own work. I think I'm really interested in what lies beneath that term, and maybe we can unpack that first, and then we could get to trauma-informed research later. in a sense, I guess it does what it says on the tin. Participatory action research is really concerned with action research, and I think that is actually a really important aspect of what that work or that kind of idea is doing in the world, is thinking about, in some ways, the big question about, well, what's the point of research? Like, what is research for? Like, I think it really poses that question, and it suggests, in a sense, that research needs to make some kind of change in the world. Like it needs to be work that actually results in something changing, that some action needs to take place.
Yeah.
I think it's very much research about, which is action oriented. And I think the crucial thing with the P word, in a sense, is actually, well, who gets to play in research? So in some ways, I think it's a term that's raising these really big, much more meta level questions, which is like, well, what's the point of research anyway? Like, why do we do what we do? Does it achieve anything in the world? I think action research says, yeah, it needs to achieve something in the world. I think participatory action research says, well, who gets to be a researcher? You know, like, who are these people who are researchers? And I think this is a thing I'm really interested in my own work, is about that kind of repositioning of power. So that rather than the researcher having this kind of almost like godlike role of standing above a situation and kind of researching on communities or on individuals, it's much more around flipping that and around creating a much more level playing field where communities and individuals are themselves researchers. And so I guess at the cusp of participatory action research was a kind of radical moment, which really challenged a lot of the power structures within research and said research is not something done on or to individuals or communities, in particular, say communities that are more marginalized, but is actually those individuals and communities are kind of centrally involved. And I guess a lot flows out of that. We could talk more about the details that flows out of that, you know, which is loads of stuff I think about research methods around particular more iterative ways of working around ethics, and we'll get onto that. So I guess the terminology I've tended to use is really to think about co-produced research or participatory research. So I think that's the terminology that's tended to be used within history or within the humanities. It's tended to be used in a whole host of disciplines, is really to think about, well, actually, how can researchers, us as academic researchers, how can we really think hard about repositioning research so that research is a much more shared agenda, and the power is much more evenly distributed. And I guess that's something we can maybe start unpicking a little bit as we think a bit more about some of the learning and methods and approaches.
In education, it's so interesting because we talk about participatory action research as really being community-based research that is in service of the community. So that the research questions have to come out of what are the community interests, and that the researcher who comes is really about bringing their expertise and their access to power and to human ethics and all of those sorts of things. But it has to be from the community members, and it has to be driven by them, which I think is a really interesting tension when we talk about what are we doing in research and even in humanities research. You know, what are we doing, say, even in our own project, where we start talking about working with genocide survivors, and we're working with artists, and we're bringing these groups together. So really, we are driving the impetus, but how can we make that in service of the community?
Yeah, and I think that's so important, Andy, that idea of, you know, like, the person who frames the research questions, there's an awful lot of power in that process, isn't there, of framing a research question, because it says this question matters, like this is the important thing to research. And I think that is, in a sense, that's been traditionally a lot in much of academic research. And I guess a lot of these participatory action research, community research, co-produced research are kind of critiquing a model, which is a model where the academic chooses the research question. In a sense, I think often our funding models within the academy they really benefit academics, because it's academics who apply for funding. And so in a sense, academics choose the research question. And that's one thing I've been really interested in kind of destabilizing in a lot of the work I've been doing. So one thing we did in Brigstow, in setting Brigstow up, was that we said that all too often the academic frames the question, and then they turn to community partners to say, hey, help me answer this question. And the question may be totally irrelevant, or it might be the wrong question. It might be a dumb question. And so one of the things that we did was we really tried to think about, well, how can we create the kind of space, an equitable space, where everyone can get around the table and co-produce the research questions. So let's start right at the very first part of a project, which is how can all of us find a question that makes sense to all of us, a question that feels really meaningful. And so we literally got into the position, which I guess is really unusual, where we were like saying, we want to pay for your expertise in framing a research question. So if you're a member of a community, say with lived experience of marginalization in some way, shape or form, we felt like we actually need you at the table to work out what the smart question is, because I may not well know what the smart question is, that I'm coming with my own positionality to create a question. And so one of the things we really paid attention to was about how can you destabilize power so that people are right there at the outset, everyone's involved at the outset to say, this is the question that we need answering, this is the question that's really important or significant.
Thank you, Tim. In terms of being a humanist in this conversation and in this cycle, who or what is community for you as a humanist, and how does this research question evolve out of community, specifically with that humanist frame?
Yeah, gosh, that is such a hard question, Matt, because I think, this is like, now to get a bit too like kind of meta, isn't it? That I think all of these terms are really hard to define. What is community? We talk a lot about, in Brigstow, the center that I set up, we talked a lot about like academics partnering with communities, or in some of the projects that I've worked on, a history project, we talked about like community partners, or a project that was a more kind of interdisciplinary project, we had community partners. And I think one of the things that I think is really important to think about is that communities are complex, and to kind of recognize that complexity. And I think one of the challenges that we've always faced in Brigstow or in the other projects that I've been involved in is that different communities have different levels of power and access to work with academics or to work with universities. That, in a sense, when we say, okay, let's take a kind of ideal world, a utopian world, we say, as academics, we're really committed to working with communities in equitable ways. And we're really committed to communities framing the research questions, or co-framing, co-creating the research questions with us, and then co-creating the research with us. One thing that I think is really important to recognize is that not all communities are equal, that there's real inequalities of power and inequalities of access to the kinds of worlds maybe that we operate in, which are worlds that access research funding or access a particular kind of knowledge, within the academy. And so one thing we've been really aware of, I think, is that often what we found, certainly in Bristol, is a tendency that we will default to certain communities over others because they're communities that are easier to work with, in quote unquote. And another thing I think that we've often found is that accessing communities is there's often gatekeepers, like critical gatekeepers. So when we talk about academics working with communities, I think sometimes what we work with is we work with certain powerful gatekeepers. And I think gatekeepers play a really important role. In many ways, they play an important role, but they don't play an entirely unproblematic role. And I think that's one thing that we've been really aware of. And I think it's a really important question to ask yourself if you're an academic, involved in working with community partners, is to really ask the critical questions of like, well, who are you working with and not working with? And why are you not working with those? Who has power within, which communities have power, and who has power within particular communities? And one thing that we just started to do a little bit in our work was we started to reflect a bit on almost like auditing from our position. So we were operating this research institute across the whole university, just to look at like which particular parts of our city were we working with or not working with, and to ask the question why, or which particular social or ethnic groups or religious groups were we working with or not working with, and ask the question of why. That I think, access to the academy is not entirely equal. And I think that's one thing that's really important to work with. So in a sense, just to answer your question, a community is anyone, isn't it? Like we're all in communities, But actually, I think what's really important to think about is the kind of intersectional sense of like, well, which communities have more or less power, and what can universities or academics do to really enable access, kind of much more equal access from all sorts of different communities. I mean, maybe some communities, for them, the question of research may not feel like a priority. You know, it may feel like something that actually I just want to try and get by day to day. Like I don't have any time to be involved in research. And I think those are the places where, in a sense, we really need to think about how do we respect that, or how do we work really hard to enable all to participate who want to, you know, within participatory action research. You know, if the P word matters, then I guess there's a lot of onus on us to think about what does participation look like, you know.
Yeah, and I think and the right of the right of engagement and non-engagement. I think there's also this idea that, you know, we talk about wanting to encourage everyone to participate and to be in service of them, but some groups may say to us, that's something we have to do ourselves. We appreciate your offer, you know, but that is not a priority for us right now, or that is not a priority that we want you to be engaged in. So when you are navigating this work, you know, what are some of the challenges that come up when working with those communities? Like, you know, the professional engagement, the intellectual engagement, the personal relationships. What are some of the challenges that come up in that process?
I mean, I think the challenges are many. And I guess what we've been interested in doing is thinking about, well, actually, how can we address some of those challenges? So I guess right from the get-go, one thing that I think is really important to recognize is that, that in a sense, I think the academy is unusual in privileging research in the way it does. So, you know, if you think about those of us who work in a kind of university context, I guess for us, the big two things we're interested in are often teaching and research. Like those really matter to us. Whereas for a lot of other partners that we might work with, actually all sorts of other things matter, like in terms of the priorities, that all sorts of other things matter. We found that especially, I think, working with community organizers and community organizations, that for a community organization, it might be the same for a creative partner, or for an industrial partner, or for a government partner, or a policy partner, that all sorts of other things matter enormously to them. And one thing we've been really interested in doing is framing those kinds of conversations where we can talk about what matters to us as individuals within institutional contexts. So to kind of recognize the relative demands on our time and the kind of relative priorities. And so to think about, like, in a sense, that honest conversation, which is like, for me as an academic, research really matters. It's like so important. And I think
curiosity and inquiry and all of those wonderful things.
Exactly. And it also matters for me in a way, professionally and personally, in terms of my own career development. And I think what we wanted to do was really bring those things to the fore as well, that as academics coming into this work, that we're not coming as neutral agents. We come with a degree of self-interest, and to be able to own that. And so one of the things I think we're really interested in doing is thinking about how can everyone own the self-interest in the room. So not to pretend that there isn't any self-interest, but to be really upfront about that. And so to have the kind of conversation, which I think are often difficult conversations, which is like, what's in it for me? So for everyone to be able to say that. So if I'm a member of a community, to be able to say, like, this is my non-negotiable, like, this is what I need from this project, like, this absolutely has to happen. And these are the pressures I'm under at the moment. These are the priorities. And for academics to say the same, and to have those kinds of conversations, what we've tended to do is, because I think those conversations are often quite difficult to have, maybe for British people, maybe for Canadians as well.
Canadians,
especially for Canadians. Yeah.
That I think what we've done is we've created a whole set of playful tools. So in the end, we created a whole set of really playful ways for people to have the really difficult conversations. Because what we found after a while of doing these projects was that people felt like they couldn't say that, or there wasn't an easy place to have that. And so what we've done is we've tried to create those like totally upfront. So here's an opportunity for everyone in the room to be involved in owning what they need from a project, what their priorities are, what they personally have to get, what institutionally they might need to get, like what are the limits for them because of maybe a set of responsibilities they have, like when can they give time, when they can't give time, how much time can they give, what do they want to give of themselves, what do they not want to give of themselves, what are they happy to do and not happy to do. And so I think that's one of the things that I've often found is that I think one of the challenges of this work is that we just don't talk honestly about all that stuff that really matters about like what we want to bring and get from this project. And so one thing I've been really interested in doing is just thinking about how can we create really playful, like easy ways to have those incredibly difficult conversations, like about who gets the money, like who's being paid, not paid, how much are they being paid, like what happens to them. And it was interesting, like I learned this the hard way, I guess. One of the projects we did a project which I thought was like, oh, hugely successful. And then one of the community partners chatted to me later and said, oh, that was like really awful project. And I was like, what was awful about it? It seemed like such a successful project. You know, it seemed like you guys got on so well and you created this you did this amazing research. And they said, what happened was we felt like the academics took the research and then they swanned off to New York to give a paper based on the research at this kind of swanky, fancy conference. And it felt like there was a point where all this kind of mutuality or co-production fell down, that there was no longer participation. It felt like it was much more back to a kind of traditional transactional model where you kind of extract this research from a community and then you go off and make your fame and fortune for it. And it was really interesting because I really thought, gosh, that's interesting. Like research stretches not just from framing the research question, but it moves all the way through to all of the aspects of dissemination of a research project. And it was interesting because learning from that process, when a colleague of mine, Josie McClellan, and we did a project which was working with peer researchers to research the history of an activist organization in Bristol. And one of the things that we did, the first things we did was we made sure that every conference that we present this research at, the entire team came. So all of the peer researchers came. We provide childcare to make this happen, and they would stay in the same hotel as us, and they would have the same billing, because we felt like actually some of those things matter. Like it's often the small stuff that matters. You know, within if we're talking participation, the P word, then like participation has to kind of carry out and flow out at lots of different levels. And for us, that meant, you know, that if we get invited to a conference, everyone comes. It's either everyone or no one, because that's kind of critical.
I have a quick little follow-up question before I go to Matt. In terms of the process part of this, right? This becomes a huge process.
Yeah, it does.
And as you said, that idea from framing to all forms of dissemination. So how is it that you're navigating that process piece? You've touched on some of that as part of it, but also thinking about when we go back to the mechanisms of research that we get to fund these sorts of things, we have to convince our funders in some case that this extra money is worth it in order to truly have that ethos as well as methodology. And I know that that's something that we have been talking about as part of our project, and Charlotta and I have been talking about this a lot, is that, yes, it's great that we have this approach and that we are working in a participatory way. But if we're saying that that's our ethos as well, then we have to be following up and making sure that that's always part of what we are doing. And so from your experience in your process, I mean, that's a wonderful example. Is there a behind the curtain kind of way of thinking about that?
Yeah, and I think that is the idea of process is so key, I think, to participatory action research or co-produced research, because it very much sees it as iterative, doesn't it? Always that there's an iterative process, because so many people are involved that by nature there's a kind of iterative circle of like framing research questions, of undertaking some research, maybe tweaking those research questions, reflecting on it, tweaking those, kind of framing things again, working in a slightly different way. And I think one thing that I guess I've always thought about is that it needs a lot of time. I mean, I think that's one of the challenges, isn't it? Is that it needs time. And I guess funders often have very kind of clear deadlines, don't they? They're like, you can have 2 years funding.
It's
or
linear too.
And this, you know, that if you're going to work in that sort of iterative way, it needs a lot of time. And I think especially time for reflection, which is often the thing that's not built in. I think it also needs a lot of trust, because in a sense you kind of have to trust the process. Like you've got to trust that the process is going to get you to the right place. I think one thing we found is that it's really hard to promise outputs to funders, because in a sense you don't really know what the output is going to be, because you know, otherwise the danger is the academic writes the output and says like, this is what we're going to deliver, because the output has to emerge out of the process. You know, that there's got to be a sense of, we frame the research questions together, we undertake the process, we reflect, and we work out what outputs are most necessary and most relevant for the different communities represented within this project. And so I think time and trust are kind of critical things. And I guess with that, I think it's probably where one thing we've tried to do in some ways in many of the projects to kind of appease the funder, I guess, or to, you know, reassure the funder that we're not just going to waste this money, because often it's public money, isn't it, that we're often getting, and it's really important to respect that this is money that's coming from people's taxes, that it's really, you know, it's really important to be responsible, is to pay a lot of attention to process and governance. So to think really hard about process and governance. So one project that we worked on, which I think was a really challenging but really important project, was it's a project called a Connected Communities project, which was called Productive Margins. And it was a project which the basic idea of the project was really to think about how do we think about regulation differently? So regulation is a kind of central part of governance and a central part of law. What would happen if we took those traditionally excluded from discussions about regulation and brought them to the center? So what if we brought people from the margins to the center of thinking about regulation? And one thing that we did there was that we had a kind of almost like a governing body for the project that was representative of everyone involved in the project. So it was representative not just of the academic partners, but all of the community partners. And that group made all of the key decisions, and it met regularly. And I think in some ways you could say we could have done the research a lot quicker if we hadn't had that. But it felt to me like it was really important to have that group that would meet, where in a sense the governance of the project would be owned by all of those involved in the project, so community partners as much as academic partners, and that and in a sense there'd be oversight of process, that group would oversee a process that would be about generating the research questions, identifying which money would go where to which projects, so kind of holding the purse strings of the project, and then overseeing all of the outputs, and not in a way that was a kind of like, we didn't want it to be almost like this was the kind of like the danger is, I guess, if you redistribute power, isn't it? So like you kind of say, okay, the powers are now in the hands of 8 people rather than like 2 people, and those 8 people happen to be a mix of academics and community partners. But it was really about saying, like, we want to actually radically redistribute power, and we want to make sure there is a governance process, because we want to make sure we use this money wisely. But we want that governance to be as broadly framed as possible, to ensure active participation in governance. Because I guess the danger can be sometimes you end up with a kind of governance board that's really the academics making all the decisions over here. And then here is the research taking place. And I think people see through that, like people sniff that and kind of see through that. And so we've been kind of careful to try and reframe that.
I want to follow up on this policy question and the idea of funders. So if you're joining us from the community, a lot of our research is publicly funded. In Canada, we have tri-councils. In England, I believe it's the same.
It is, absolutely.
What do you think the role is in terms of funding agencies or the university or institutes such as Brigstow in thinking about money differently, which you already are in the sense in terms of bringing an entire community to a conference in New York? So to give you a brief example, Canada just announced that they're doing a high risk, high reward funding model this coming year, with this sort of understanding that big breakthroughs might not be small iterative claims, but you just need someone to be out there doing something strange that then has this breakthrough. And it seems to me there's something similar happening here of putting money out into the community, respecting the actual labor that's happening out there. So in your experience, if you were to talk with a policymaker in Canada and England, how should we be rethinking how money is distributed in these grant applications so that the focus isn't just on the academic?
Yeah, I mean, I think the money matters, doesn't it? You know, like we all know that, that money really matters because money drives so many things. And so I think there is a real need for funders to pay attention to that. And I guess also for us as academics who often receive this funding, to think really hard about how we spend that money and how we can ensure that that money is distributed fairly. One thing that we've always thought about is the way that I guess at the core of participatory action research or co-produce research is a sense that everyone's knowledge matters, and a kind of key sense of respecting different kinds of knowledge, so that knowledge that emerges from lived experience is as valuable as knowledge that maybe emerges from a kind of disciplinary training or from a creative practice, that all knowledge matters. And so one thing we've done is really thought carefully about, in a sense, ensuring that we pay for people's labor and we don't ask people to perform labor that's unpaid, because that's about respecting them and their knowledge. So, you know, one thing that I've always been really strong on within Brigstow and in the UK is that, say, when we work with artists, that we pay the recommended union rate for artists, because we respect that their knowledge matters as much as academic knowledge, that creative skills, and that it's really important to recognize that and to pay people, you know, correctly. And the same with our community peer researchers. Sometimes we've worked with peer researchers, and I don't know what the situation in Canada is, where we've had to be quite creative because people maybe are on social security benefits, which means that they can't receive a waged role. But there's other ways of ensuring that we are able to ensure that people get something that matters to them. So in the most recent project that Josie and I worked on, we ensured that there was fully paid childcare for individuals to participate, that individuals got credits and recognition for a kind of foundation degree that they meant they could go on to do additional study or further study if they wanted, that they were compensated for their time in whatever way we were able to do that. We fed them well, that we offered, in a sense, respect. And so I think a lot of this is about what's the way of respecting what someone brings to the project. Sometimes that's money. In the case of artists, I really think, you know, it's about paying artists a fair wage in respect to this. For others, it might be other ways of demonstrating and sharing respect. And so for us in that project, one of the things of showing the respect of co-researchers was that we all went to a conference together, and we all stayed in the same hotel, and we all ate the same meals, because we were all people who had knowledge. We'd all contributed to the research, and so we would also all disseminate the research. And so I think it's about how can you ensure respect, that you respect the value of knowledge that everyone brings to a project, and in a sense you bring, you know, you kind of nurture that sense of mutual respect within a project team, you know, because I guess for us, you know, researching the kind of research we've done, like the research would not happen without all of the participants, the academic participants, the community participants, the creative participants, all of them play a critical role. And so it's really been important to demonstrate that kind of respect. And I think that's one thing, I guess, that I'd want funders to do. I guess the other thing maybe is just, I mean, I think one thing we've been able to do in Brigstow is to fund the research question generation. And I guess that's one thing that often doesn't happen with funders, that funders demand that you come to them with a fully worked out, you know, like a 12-page, 24-page, 36-page funding application. One thing I think it's really hard to get is money to get everyone in the room together. And I think people do need money just to get in the room together. Sometimes it might be money to pay for childcare so that you can lose some caring responsibilities for a day, so you can be in the room to help frame the research questions. Or you might have other access needs to be in the room to help frame the research questions. You might need translators, to pay translators, or you might need to pay a facilitator to enable that to happen. And that's one thing I think funders don't do. And I think that, to me, would be really critical, is that funders would pay small pots of money to enable people to genuinely co-produce the research questions. Because I think all too often in the projects I've been involved in, we, the academics, have largely led on creating the research questions, and in a sense then we've been trying to play catch up afterwards to almost make it a bit more participatory, because we wrote the funding bids, you know, the 24-page funding bid. And I think that is one challenge that I think funders really need to get around, to work around, if they're really keen for much more community participatory projects.
Yeah. And so
Absolutely.
when we're thinking about this, so we've talked about the institutional side, and now let's sort of switch to thinking about the community side of this. And in our particular project, we're working with survivors, as well as the artists, and those survivors are situated within particular networks, and they have their own support, and often there are issues of trauma and challenge and mistrust when it comes to people from institutions such as ours who are coming in to start doing research. Even if we say we're doing it with them, we're still doing research. What are some of the experiences that you've had thinking about challenging communities that you've been working with in the community, those people that you're going to? And so what are some of the successes or challenges that you have noticed as you've been doing this work over the last few years?
Yeah, I think there's, I guess there's been some really great successes and also a few challenges, and maybe I could just give you an illustration of a few of those. I mean, one thing that's been interesting is most recently in my own work, I've been working with a Holocaust survivor from Hungary to co-write together. And so a really different way of working that I guess a lot of my work in the past has been more kind of traditional oral history work, that I'll be working with survivors and I'll be interviewing survivors and then drawing upon their interviews to write up the results or to disseminate it in some shape or form. And that's fairly traditional oral history work. And one of the things that as a watchword in oral history is the idea of shared authority. And the oral history is a methodology which is about shared authority, in sense giving individuals voice. But I really wanted to push that a little bit further, because I was like, actually, what I'd love to do is I'd love to do something that's much more like iterative, whereby in a sense, this is much more about developing a longer term relationship with a survivor. So that it's not just me going and doing like a 3-hour interview, or even doing a series of 3-hour interviews and then writing it up, going away and writing it up. But I much more want to frame the research questions with a survivor, which is like, actually, what should we write about? Like, what interests us both? Let's have a conversation to just kind of work out what interests us both. And we started to talk, and we both said, actually, we're kind of interested in trying to understand what the ghetto is. I'm kind of interested in that. She had an experience of living in a ghetto in Hungary, and she's like, oh, I don't know how to define it, Tim. Like, I'd actually really like to try and think that through. So we started to kind of find a nascent area of research, in a sense. We started to co-create a research question. We're both quite interested in thinking about ghettoization and the ghetto. And then rather than me doing, okay, I take that question and I ask you a load of questions in a kind of classic oral history way, what if we just kind of have a conversation? So we ended up having a conversation over 6 months. Sometimes we'd Zoom, sometimes we'd meet around her kitchen table, sometimes we'd write to each other. And we'd kind of punt back and forth a set of questions that she'd ask me questions, because in a sense, I'm empowering her to be a questioner as much as to be someone who is asked questions. And I would ask her questions. And we punt this back and forth over 6 months. And then we started to write together. So we then said, we feel like we've got something that we want to write. So let's write a journal article together where we kind of try and explore together, trying to reimagine or re-understand what we mean by ghetto or ghettoization. And so for me, I think that was a really successful project. And it was really interesting because she's someone who has been interviewed before within oral history. And she wrote to me at the end, she said, Tim, it's really interesting. I really felt like you made me an equal in this project. And I'd never had that experience. Like within all the oral history projects I've had, I've always felt like here's the smart historian, the interviewer who asks the questions, and I just answer. And here was a kind of new sense of mutual respect. And so I think for me, that's been a project where I feel like, actually, that was a really lovely project. It took a lot of time.
Yeah.
I think there was a sense there was something in it for both of us, that we were both kind of, I think the crucial thing was we found a question we were both interested in exploring, and something that mattered to us. And I think that, I think genuinely that's the thing that we've got to do, is find the thing that matters to all of us, because I think then there's a bit of investment, isn't there?
Yeah.
And there's something that comes back to us. And I think that was the time well spent, was the slow time of like trying to find what it was that we were really both genuinely interested in. Because I think as academics, Andy, you talked about curiosity. I think as academics, we're interested in lots of things.
So much, yeah.
like probably too many things. So I think actually often it's about working with our community partners or with creators to find out, to listen to what are you interested in, and what resonates. So rather than me going in and saying, this is what we're going to do, it's like, well, let's talk and find out what you're interested in. And I think I can find something that resonates there that I think I'd be interested in, but I think also maybe a journal, we could write a journal article.
In the back of our heads, we're always got our spidey senses for that kind of stuff.
And we need to be honest about that, don't we? That's how we're judged as academics. That's like how our line manager judges us, or how we're judged for promotion or whatever. And so we can be honest.
An interesting follow-up question, because I think when you sit and speak with somebody for a series of time, it almost becomes anthropological, right? You are engaging, and that really puts us in that very interesting interdisciplinary kind of space. And it bringing in my interest back to this idea of how, a humanist and an educator and a librarian sit down to a conversation, and how do we have that conversation, because it is kind of counter to the way that the institution functions, but it's in the best interest of our community partners. So, how do we navigate that interdisciplinarity when we are putting these projects together? So I think about, yourself as a historian, is it about building a team? Is it about broadening your scope? What are some of the interdisciplinary considerations that you have?
Yeah, and I guess that makes it all the more complex, doesn't it? Because I think it's complex enough. Like when Josie and I were working as two historians with peer researchers and a community organization and some artists, that's complex enough because there's a lot going on. It becomes all the more complicated when it's like a historian and, like you said, an educator, someone from education studies, or an anthropologist or library. When we start bringing all of those different disciplines, I think one thing is about almost finding a common language. Is like, how can we, and we found that here, didn't we? Like, is it participatory action research? Is it co-produced research? Like, can we find a common language? We've done some work on that in Brigstow. We've done some playful work, which is about helping people to find a common language that they can use, that everyone can understand and use within the research project. So whether you're coming from a community organization or from a community from an artist background or a different disciplinary background, can we find a kind of common language that we can use? And I think one other thing I guess there is about like respecting and cherishing difference. Like I think in terms of challenge, I think some of the projects that we've worked on where things haven't gone so well is where we haven't done that, is where we've not enabled people to play to their strengths, and we've been kind of we've been reticent of expertise. Like we felt like expertise feels like a very, very hierarchical term. Like it's a word that we've not wanted to, like we've disciplinary expertise or kind of lived expertise or artistic expertise, creative expertise, like the skill sets that people bring to projects, we sometimes felt a little bit like, oh, we shouldn't use that word. And it was really interesting. In one of the projects we worked on, Productive Margins, there was a point I really remember where a lot of our community partners said, like, you academics, you just need to bring your expertise to bear, because you're just kind of like too tentative. You're like, you don't want to tread on any toes. You don't want to be, you're so conscious of positionality and power relations that you don't want to say anything and that you're not contributing. And they said it's like it's almost like you're silent research partner. You're not really research partners. You're bringing nothing to the table. In a sense, we got a real telling off. And I think it was a really interesting moment in that project where it was like, actually, I think they're really right, that we are so much like saying, this is your project. And this is about your expertise, that in a sense they were saying, no, we need your expertise. We actually need you to help us frame a research question, because that's kind of something you're great at doing. Or we need you to help us think about interview methodology, or we need you to think about this. And I think that was one thing that I felt was a real learning curve for us as a team, where we're almost so aware of our kind of power in the room that we didn't ever want to bring our expertise to bear. And I think navigating different expertise and respecting different expertise is something that I think is really critical. And that's about amongst disciplines, as much as it is about academic and communities or artists. Like, how can we have that honest conversation of saying, like, this is what I can and cannot bring to this team, and then to play that role and almost to kind of respect those roles, as well as, I guess, you also want that stuff to happen, don't you? Which is where things happen in between.
Where the serendipity.
Yeah, and you don't want to typecast people. You don't want to say like you only do that because you're a historian. Actually, lots of people can bring something to exploring the past, can't they? We don't want to just like kind of and otherwise it feels like it just becomes transactional. Like you want to move beyond transactional relationships in these kinds of projects, and so you need to have a set of processes and ways of working that allow for the serendipity to happen, whilst also I think allowing people to really play to their strengths and bring their expertise to the table and to respect and acknowledge that expertise.
And so much learning happens for us when we have the opportunity to work with people from other areas. And I think that that's one of the things that's so amazing, you know, is I love working with Matt because I always learn so much about how things happen in his part of the world and how they think and all of that sort of stuff. And that is such a valuable contribution, because not only then is it us gathering information or working with community partners, but we are, I think, growing as scholars in the complexity of work that we're able to engage with, the people that we are interested in working with, and that allows our own careers and pathways to move as well. So,
yeah, and I think like
jump back in again.
I mean, like you, Andy, I've totally found that, like that, all of these projects that I've done, I feel like I've learned so much from others. Like in interdisciplinary projects, I've reflected about the limits of my own discipline, you know, and I've learned new things along the way. There's like people introduce you to new worlds, don't they?
Yeah.
Like whether that be a kind of academic world of a literature that you've never encountered or read, or whether that be the world of a lived experience that you've never entered into. Like I feel like it's incredibly enriching. And I feel, I mean, this sounds awful, but I feel, you know, like in terms of my own like continuing personal development, that this kind of working has been like massively important for me in terms of just shaping me as a scholar, as a person, that I feel like I've got so much more out of these kinds of projects than probably I've ever given. And I've, you know, it's been a real privilege to be involved. And I guess that's why I kind of tend to gravitate to these projects, because I'm like, oh gosh, this is another opportunity for me to learn. And that feels like a really rich thing, to be someone who's kind of constantly able to learn. Like that's a lovely thing about maybe being in the academy and being in these kinds of projects, is to really, you know, grow as a person and grow as an intellectual.
Exactly.
And done really well, because what you're talking about is almost being comfortable with the discomfort of vulnerability and a humility, right? In the sense that I don't know everything, which is something I still feel uncomfortable saying in front of colleagues, right? Because that's how our disciplinary fields form, is we almost form our disciplinary fields in opposition to how other people define themselves. I was going to ask you a question about public reception to your work, but I see that Franziska has asked a really great question that sort of builds on what everyone has just been saying in the past minute. And she's asking, alongside dissemination, does evaluation play a role in the participatory action processes? And when you put in that word evaluation, all of a sudden we go back into that power structure of people saying what's good, what's not. So I'd really love to hear your response to that.
Yeah, we thought a lot about that in projects, because I think one thing that is really important in participatory action research or in co-produced research is intentionally bringing reflection into the process. And I guess the word reflection is often used rather than evaluation. Like evaluation can feel a little bit metrics driven, or it can feel like, you know, is this successful or is this failing? You know, like it can feel a bit binary. But I think that sense of reflective learning is critical. Is how can you build into the process, the iterative process of research, moments of reflection where as a whole collective and individually, we can reflect on, like, maybe individually, what am I learning in this, and what am I able to bring or am I receiving from this project? But collectively, how is this going for us? Like, what is working, what's not working, what are we starting to find? Like, where does it feel like the energy is? What could we, and what's not working so well, what could we do around that? And so one thing that we've always tried to do in these projects is to build that in, and to really put time for that, because I think it's the kind of thing that can get squeezed out. And so to have, often with productive margins, what we would do is we'd have 2-day meetings, and we would ensure that at least one of the days of those 2-day meetings was a moment for reflection, was entirely given over to reflection, because otherwise we tend to get stuck, kind of caught up with the urgent stuff, and just the kind of tyranny, you know, of the urgent. One thing that we did in the most recent project Josie and I did, so the project that Josie and I led on, the aspect that I actually led on was I led on evaluation. And so we actually brought in a kind of part-time evaluator and myself into the project to be involved in the project, to enable evaluation and reflection all the way through the project. We were really surprised that the funders were willing to fund that. It was a bit of a punt when we put the project in. We said, we want Josie to lead on undertaking the project, but we actually need Tim, to lead on kind of critically reflecting and evaluating on the project. And so my role was not delivery. Intentionally, it wasn't about the project delivery. It was about encouraging reflection and critical evaluation all the way through, so that there was learning built into the project. And the funders, I think we made a compelling case, the funders funded it, and I think it was really valuable for that project. So as well as writing a kind of final project report, which was something that we felt like we could put into the world for others to learn from, we were actually involved very much in the project itself, in the self-learning at every stage of the project, so that we could go back to Josie and we could say, this is what we see happening, like this is, and to bring Josie into, like, Josie, what are you happening? So what we did actually was we did midway interviews with everyone involved in the project, and then we could reflect that back. And so in a sense, we became almost like the neutral individuals within the project, that everyone in the project could articulate to them to how, and we could almost like play that role of helping people to reflect mid-project, so that reflection, once we reflect back to the whole project, could then inform the second half of the project, as well as then at the end reflecting back to the whole project and then reflecting out to others. And so I think that to me is a really critical role, is like in these kinds of projects, make sure you give enough time to reflection, and make sure you do it at regular periods, and that there's a way in which that reflection can feed back. So a kind of iterative feedback loop is really central to what you do. And I think, to me, it's also at the end, make sure that you don't just produce a set of outputs, but you also produce a set of learning. Like, what's the learning? So, you know, like we started talking about process right at the beginning, didn't we? Like, process is about learning. Like, what's that learning? How can you capture that learning? How can you disseminate and articulate that learning? Because that learning is probably as valuable, or if not maybe more valuable, than the outputs. And I think that's something, you know, we could think about in this project, and I think is really important to think about in all participatory action research or co-produced research.
Well, it's different audiences,
Absolutely.
right? So how are you informing the public, your outward community that you're working with? How are you informing the academy? How are you helping other and teaching other researchers as they come forward?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's another question from the community, and it says, I'm interested in the role of the community member who is a researcher. I have found as a community member, I would have a form of knowledge that other academics might not have through my own oral history.
Mhm.
How do you consolidate community knowledge that goes against common assumptions within the academy?
Yeah, that is a great question, isn't it? And I think, again, here, this is a question of respect, isn't it? Is that, you know, if we take as a kind of starting basis for these kinds of ways of working, participatory action research, co-produced research, respecting all knowledge, then I think what we do is we respect the knowledge that's created within the academy, and we respect the knowledge that's lived knowledge within a community, and we respect them equally and bring them into conversation with each other. And that's something that I've been really interested in doing with the survivor that I'm working with. That one thing I bring into that conversation is I bring, in a sense, a knowledge of the historiography, don't I? So I bring a knowledge of, you know, Holocaust historiography of ghettoization. I bring a knowledge of oral history methods and approaches. She brings lived experience of the Holocaust and a whole set of knowledge which has been built up around her own reflection and reading post-Holocaust. You know, that in a sense, it's not just me who's been reading, is it? It's not just academics are reading.
Yeah.
All sorts of people read, and we draw upon, you know, different traditions. And in a sense, what's been really interesting in that project is really bringing those two together and being happy with the moments where they don't meet.
Yeah.
So to be happy with the sense that actually, here's an academic literature that says this, and here's a lived experience that says that we bring the two into tension with each other. And we, in a sense, make both of them clear, that we don't say, well, one's right and one's wrong. Yeah. That actually maybe we need to live with a degree of tension. And I think that's one of the things that's been really important in the success of that project, is to then think about how can we bring those tensions to the fore in the things that we write, so that we don't have to write a kind of single linear narrative, but we can have a narrative that has these moments of tension within them. And we can respect different kinds of knowledge. So maybe give you just one example of that. There's a moment where when we were talking, this survivor, she said to me, "Oh, the reason that we survived was because of this. Because we left Budapest and we went to this other town." And I knew she was wrong, in a sense. Like, the academic literature says that actually Jews in Budapest were far more likely to survive than Jews who were in smaller towns. So this is one of those moments, isn't it, where you get a kind of clash of knowledge. The academic literature, the body of knowledge, says that Jews in Budapest were more likely to survive. Her lived experience was she survived because she went to Debrecen. And what was really interesting for me was I thought, in a sense, first of all, I pushed back. I was like, no, actually, the academic literature says this. She pushed back, and we had this really useful kind of moment. And I think it's about, Matt, like you said, about humility, or just developing relationships where you can actually have those really tough conversations, where you can kind of push back at each other and you can respect each other. And what was really interesting was I really felt like, actually, what's fascinating about the academic literature is the academic literature always talks in a kind of abstract, that it takes all of the data points and it abstracts them. And that's the nature of academic knowledge. What she knew was that she wouldn't just be living in Budapest, she'd be living in this particular flat in Budapest with these people. And that actually what happened in that flat was that the Arrow Cross arrived in that flat and took those Jews who were living there to the Danube and shot them into the river. And she would have been part of that. And I thought this was one of those really interesting moments about abstract knowledge and kind of embodied knowledge. And in a sense, I think one of the things that maybe is interesting in a lot of these projects is, how do we bring those two together? So how do we bring the kind of abstraction which is valued within our world, Andy, isn't it? In the academy, it's about the abstraction of knowledge, and how do we bring it together with much more intimate embodied knowledge, which is much more valued within, say, communities or in oral history practices. And I think it's about respecting different forms of knowledge. And I think crucially thinking about ways of disseminating knowledge that doesn't mean we flatten that all out. We don't lose one in the other, but brings the two in tension and kind of makes that and lays that tension bare and thinks about, maybe I think we need to think about new ways of disseminating knowledge.
Yeah, and I think that that's, for me, one of the most exciting pieces in But I Live, and the way that we're moving forward with the next project, is that this is about taking an academic history that exists and saying, these are the unique individual stories that are within that. And we're not, we're looking at stars within a constellation rather than just the constellation. And I think that that's such a powerful history, especially when it comes from, in my perspective, when I take that to learners. So when I take this to people who are learning about a particular topic, they often become overwhelmed. I mean, especially when we talk about the Holocaust, right? About the size, the scope, all of those parts of understanding the Holocaust is almost too much sometimes for a 15 and 16-year-old to fully grasp and to understand. So when we start with an individual story that is, that little tiny piece, that grain of one person's real lived experience, and then we start to situate that back within the constellation, then it starts to expand and grow, and the learner is able to see the forest for the trees as well as the forest, right? That we can go back and forth between that individual and the collective as we go. And I see that as such a strength when we start talking about participatory research and engagement with individuals as well as communities, and then that larger situation within the flow of history, or whatever it is that we're looking at.
And I think there's also something in particular about the graphic novel that's really productive there. Because I think one thing, I've always thought it's amazing about graphic novels is that you have both text and image. So you, in a sense, have two modes of communication. And if you think about a graphic novel, there's times when the two come together, aren't there? That the picture shows something and the text says the same thing, like it's either the speech bubble or the caption. But there's times when they separate, or there's times where it's just an image or there's just text. And I think what's nice about graphic novels is that I think as a form, it's a more complicated way of conveying and telling stories that can bring abstraction through text alongside an image that's maybe about an individual, or can bring them into tension. And I think there's something really about the form itself that's incredibly productive and maybe particularly suitable for thinking about ways of disseminating more complex knowledge, which is what you generate within community participatory research projects.
I hate to be the bearer of bad news here, but we're at the hour, and I feel like we could spend another hour just talking about dissemination and historical structures of knowledge sharing and so forth. but we'll probably have to save that for another time. Tim, I would just very much like to thank you for sharing your knowledge with us over the past hour. You've given me so many terms that I just want to sit with around honest conversations. A term you used frequently today was a playfulness, right? Like just the recognition that there will be these tensions, and one productive way of approaching them is through play and recognizing that. I want to add the term reflection officer to my business card. Just these important things that we perhaps wouldn't know to do or how to do in these large projects that are being co-produced and co-created. Andy, I'll hand it to you.
Oh, thank you. I think that as we close, I just want to again echo my appreciation for these wide-ranging conversations, because it's so exciting to start thinking about where we start, right? So we start in history. I started in history as well, and the ways that we continue to evolve as curious individuals. And I hope that that is one of the takeaways for our audience today, is the way that we want to continue to follow all of these different threads in so many different ways, and hopefully with the idea of being of service to the communities that we are working with. And as you said, I keep coming back to the power of not only acknowledging expertise, but acknowledging individual expertise, because I like to think we all bring our own superpowers. When we come, we are the Justice League, or whatever you want to, however you want to frame it, because you have unique superpowers, but together we're able to produce some amazing things. So thank you again to Tim. I'll give you the last word in just a second. But I also would like to remind everybody, as Heidi has put in the chat, that we have additional webinars coming up in the next couple of weeks. So we will have another session with Erin Jesse next week, talking about ethics of interviewing, and further panelists coming up in later in May. So is there anything that you would like to leave us with, Tim?
It's such a pleasure to have a conversation with the two of you. It's been really lovely to have a chance to almost like in conversation reflect back a little bit on my own kind of learning and my own journey in this space. I think I'd just pick up on one thing that Matt said. He used the word humility, and I think those are words that we don't often use within the academy. Like think about the last time that the word humility was used within the academy, or if you're like a PhD student, we don't really talk about that as part of the training of the PhD program, or maybe within undergraduate studies. And I think Matt, you're right, that I think that really is, there's a lot of stuff which is a kind of is soft skills, but it's more than that. It's about a kind of ethical orientation, I think, isn't it? It's about a way that we see ourselves and see others. And I think things like humility and respect, those kind, and honesty, those kinds of words, might sound like kind of slightly old-fashioned, or a little bit, like kind of not have no place within the academy or within something as serious as research. But I actually think they're terms and kind of orientations that are really critical to a lot of this work. There's one project we did, a big multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary project, and people asked us, like, how was that so successful? Because all our projects didn't work in the same way. And one of the things we joked was, we said, actually, what was amazing, there weren't any prima donnas in the room. There wasn't a kind of big ego in the room, and that made things easier. There was just a little bit of humility, and I'm not saying it was perfect. I'm sure there were moments when our pride reared up, and we weren't these beautiful, humble people. But I think stuff like that goes a long way. And I guess that's part of my own internal reflection, is that in a sense, like, I'm always thinking, like, how can I be a good collaborator? Like the journey of collaboration starts here, doesn't it? It starts with me and my attitude and my place in the world, and how I see myself and how I see others. And I think that's one thing we rarely talk about within the academy in our research training. And I think those are really important. Like, a lot of those kind of personal qualities and personal reflection, is really critical. So thanks for bringing up the H word, Matt, because I think humility is one of the most important things in successful collaboration.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us, everybody. And we hope to see you again next week, for those who are interested. Bye.
Bye-bye.